The sun was lowering itself gently behind the distant hills when Clarence Whitfield stepped onto the porch of his old rural home. The evening sky glowed with wide strokes of orange and gold, reflecting off the fields that had surrounded his life for over 5 decades. In his hand, he held a folded note. The paper was soft at the edges, creased carefully as if his wife had touched it many times before deciding to leave it on the dining table. Clarence stood still, letting the quiet wind brush across his face. It carried the faint scent of dry leaves and earth, the familiar smell of many years spent living simply. Yet today the air felt different, heavy, almost warning. He slowly unfolded the letter, his eyes moving over the gentle handwriting he knew so well. She wrote that she needed space, time to breathe, time to understand why their home had slowly turned into a place where her heart felt forgotten. Clarence felt something inside him crumble, but the sunset offered no comfort. It simply watched him in silence. Clarence walked toward the old wooden chair that sat to the right side of the porch. The paint had peeled long ago, and the wood had grown smooth through years of use. He lowered himself into it slowly, as if the weight of the letter had aged him further within one single moment. Before him stretched fields that once held his footsteps when he was young and strong. The grass moved softly in the wind, making a grace that reminded him of his wife's calm nature. He held the note tightly, reading each word again as the sky shifted to deeper shades of evening blue. She wrote that she loved him, but love alone could not carry everything. She wrote that silence had grown thick between them, so thick that her feelings no longer made it through. Clarence closed his eyes. He felt the truth of it, raw and uncomfortable. The chair beside him was empty, and for the first time he feared it might remain that way. The next morning, Clarence walked out to the large oak tree that stood a short distance from the house. It had been their place during the early years of marriage. They used to sit beneath its shade, sharing dreams and planning the future. Clarence looked at the trunk now, older and wider, the bark marked with time in the same way his own life was marked. He remembered how his wife used to laugh then, her smile bright as sunshine through spring leaves. They talked about building a home together, raising children, making a simple life filled with honesty and effort. There were no grand promises, only steady intentions. Respect was natural then, not something they had to work for. As he stood beneath the branches, he realized he had not touched this tree with his wife in years. Life had pulled them into routine, leaving the early tenderness buried under responsibilities. He wondered whether she had felt the change long before he ever noticed it. Clarence walked toward the open field behind the house, the same place where he had built the foundation of their first home with his own hands. He could still remember the sweat on his brow, the way the sun burned down on him while he worked. His wife had brought him water, her steps light on the grass as she encouraged him with a smile. They did not have much, but they had each other, and that was enough to build a life. Respect lived naturally between them then. Every action they took carried intention. Every decision was a shared step. Clarence looked around the field now and saw the quiet truth. He had kept building the structure of life, but did not keep building the bond. He provided shelter, but stopped providing presence. He worked, he endured, he showed up in the physical sense, but not in the emotional sense. The field seemed to whisper the years he had forgotten. Later, he walked to the small garden that had once been his wife's pride. Wildflowers had taken over the edges, growing in uneven clusters. Clarence knelt down, touching the soil with tired hands. He remembered how she used to tend to each plant with care, how she found peace in the quiet work of nurturing. Back then, he would stand nearby, watching her without saying much, but she never needed words from him then. His presence was enough. Respect was simple. It lived in the everyday things. It lived in the way they shared responsibilities, the way they trusted each other without question, the way they stayed beside each other even when life was hard. Clarence stared at the garden now and realized how that quiet understanding had slowly faded. Life had become a race. Routine replaced closeness. Respect needed expression, but he had stopped expressing it. Clarence decided to walk along the dirt road that led from his home toward the small rural town nearby. He walked slowly, letting the cool air brush against his face. As he moved down the familiar path, he thought about how the world outside had changed. Expectations had changed. People had changed. Marriages were no longer built on endurance. They were built on the hope of constant happiness, something older generations never expected. He passed a small park where young couples sat with their phones instead of talking. He saw a group of teenagers arguing over small things that would be forgotten in minutes. Everything felt loud, rushed, and fragile. Modern love demanded ease. Modern love feared effort. Clarence realized that society had shaped his children's generation into people who wanted comfort without sacrifice. The same shift had touched his own home without him even noticing. As Clarence reached the wooden fence at the end of the road, he leaned on it gently and looked across the open land. The cracks in his marriage had not begun with a fight. They had begun in silence. A night when he returned home tired, and she waited for him on the porch, but he walked past her with only a nod. A morning when she wanted to talk, but he was already thinking about work. A sunset when she sat outside alone, hoping he would join her, but he remained busy. These moments were small, almost invisible, but they piled like stones. Eventually, the weight became too heavy to ignore. Clarence remembered the first time she asked him if he was tired or worried. He had brushed it off with a simple answer. He had not seen the concern in her eyes. He had not seen the beginning of distance. Clarence walked further up the hill behind his house, where he could see the entire valley stretched out below. He stood there, breathing the crisp air, and thought about the nature of respect. He finally understood it was not a feeling. It was a practice, a discipline, a daily choice. He had carried responsibility well, but he had not carried respect with the same strength in the later years. His wife did not leave because she stopped loving him. She left because she stopped feeling seen. She left because they stopped practicing the small acts that keep a relationship alive. Respect had faded slowly, like light disappearing behind clouds. Clarence felt the realization settle in his chest like a long overdue truth. When Clarence returned home, the sky was turning a deep shade of purple. The porch light flickered softly, casting a warm glow across the old wooden boards. He sat down again in the same chair beside the empty one. He thought of all the evenings she had waited for him here. He thought of the times she wanted to share stories about her day while he was lost in his own thoughts. He thought of how she often looked at him, hoping for conversation that he had no energy to give. He never meant to ignore her. He simply believed that surviving life together was enough to sustain love. But love required more than survival. It required attention. It required listening. It required respect that lived not in words, but in presence. Night settled over the land, and the stars blinked into the sky one by one. Clarence remained outside, unwilling to go back into the quiet house. He finally understood what he had missed for so long. Marriages do not fail because people stop loving each other. They fail because people stop noticing each other. They fail because routine replaces connection. They fail because respect fades quietly. Clarence held the letter once more, reading her gentle confession. She still loved him. She simply needed to feel valued again. He knew this was not the end. It was a call to wake up, a call to rebuild, a call to action. As he sat beneath the star-filled sky, he made a silent promise to himself. He would learn again. He would change. He would not let respect die without a fight. Clarence rose before sunrise the next morning. The sky was still dark, with only a thin silver glow along the horizon hinting that daylight was coming. He stepped outside onto the porch, the cool air sharp against his skin. The chair beside him remained empty, and the quiet reminded him once again of what had slipped through his fingers. He looked across the fields and wondered how many mornings his wife had waited for him to join her. He wondered how many times she had stepped outside, hoping he would follow her with even a few minutes of conversation. Clarence wrapped his arms around himself and realized He had been present in the physical sense, but absent in the emotional sense. The world around him was still, almost holding its breath, as he accepted more truths that he had avoided for too long. He walked along the gravel path that led toward the old barn, the same barn he had repaired many times throughout his life. The boards were weathered, and the roof had rusted patches, but the barn still stood strong. Clarence paused beside it, remembering how his wife used to help him carry tools or hold the ladder steady. She always supported his burdens without complaint, even when her own burdens went unnoticed. He ran his hand along the rough wooden wall, feeling the years carved into every inch of it. He realized that their marriage had become like this barn. It had stood tall through storms, through hardship, through countless seasons, but he had not checked for hidden cracks. He had not noticed the quiet damage forming underneath the surface. Respect required maintenance. He understood that now more clearly than ever. He continued walking across the property until he reached the small stream that flowed behind their land. The water moved softly over the rocks, making a gentle sound that had always soothed him. He sat on the grassy bank and watched the current move steadily forward. His wife used to sit beside him here during their early years. They talked about raising their children, planting new crops, and growing old together. He remembered how she would dip her fingers into the cool water and laugh at how cold it felt. Clarence felt a sting of regret as he realized he could not remember the last time they had come to this stream together. Life had swept them up, just as the water swept leaves downstream. They had let time carry them without intentional effort to stay connected. As the sun slowly climbed above the fields, warming the land, Clarence walked toward the small road where he and his wife used to take evening strolls. He remembered how her steps were always light and how she enjoyed the simple pleasure of watching the sky turn shades of pink and red. He had often walked ahead of her, thinking about work or bills or repairs that needed attention. He believed focusing on responsibilities was the best way to honor his family. But now he understood something painful. His wife did not want him to stop working. She wanted him to walk beside her. She wanted him to look at her with the same attention he gave to other parts of life. Respect was not only about providing, it was about companionship. Clarence stopped on the road and looked at the sky, wishing he had walked slower, listened more, and shared more. Moving further along the path, he reached the wooden bridge that crossed the creek. This bridge had been the place where he had first told her he loved her. He remembered the soft breeze of that day, the nervous tremble in his voice, and the bright hope in her eyes. Standing there now, decades later, he felt the weight of lost years pressing down on him. The bridge creaked softly beneath his feet as if sharing his grief. He closed his eyes and imagined her standing where she once stood, young and smiling. He wondered if she had ever stood here alone in recent years, remembering that moment while feeling the distance that had grown between them. Clarence realized that love spoken once was not enough to carry a lifetime. Love needed to be spoken again and again, not always in words, but through presence and effort. Clarence continued walking until he reached the field where he and his children used to play. He remembered teaching them how to run through the tall grass without tripping, laughing as they fell and got back up. He remembered the sound of his wife's voice calling them for dinner from the porch. Those were the years when life felt full and warm. Respect came naturally then, woven into the way they worked as a family. But over time, as the children grew up and moved away, Clarence and his wife found themselves living side by side without truly seeing each other. They survived life instead of sharing it. Clarence walked slowly through the field, wishing he had shown his wife the same kind of attention he once showed his children. He made his way toward the small hill behind the property, the highest place on the land. From there, he could see the entire valley. It was his favorite thinking spot. He sat on the grass and let the wind move around him. He thought about how modern marriages often struggled, how many younger couples he knew who separated within a few years. He realized they were facing the same challenges he had faced, but with even more pressure, more noise, and more distractions. People today expected constant happiness. They expected relationships to be easy, They were not taught that marriage demanded resilience, humility, patience, and work. Clarence understood that the world had changed in ways that made commitment harder, not because love had weakened, but because society had taught people to give up quickly. The hills stood quiet as Clarence reflected on all of this. As the day grew warmer, Clarence walked back toward the garden where he had knelt the day before. He decided to pull out some of the wild weeds that had taken over. He worked slowly, removing one root at a time. The act reminded him of how marriages needed care, how small issues became large when ignored. His wife's absence had forced him to see what he had neglected. He wondered how long she had waited for him to notice the small weeds growing between them. While pulling a particularly stubborn weed, Clarence felt a wave of emotion he had kept buried for years. He had loved her deeply. He had simply forgotten to show it in meaningful ways. The garden slowly began to look cared for again, and Clarence felt a quiet determination forming inside him. That evening, when the sky turned soft with the colors of dusk, Clarence walked to the mailbox at the end of the dirt road. He carried with him a letter he had written. His words were simple. He apologized. He acknowledged the hurt she had carried alone. He promised to change, not through grand declarations but through daily respect. He placed the letter in the mailbox gently, as if placing hope itself inside. He knew she might not read it right away. She might need more time. But he wanted her to know that he saw her now, that he finally understood the quiet pain she had lived with. He stood by the mailbox for a long moment before turning back toward the house, the evening air cool against his face. Over the next few days, Clarence kept himself busy outdoors. He repaired the fence she had mentioned several times in the past. He cleaned the porch where she loved to sit during summer evenings. He trimmed the hedges along the walkway. These were small tasks, but each one carried intention. Respect was in the details. He realized that marriage was not broken by one failure. It was broken by repeated neglect, and rebuilding it required repeated effort. Clarence felt both sorrow and hope as he worked. He did not know if she would return, but he wanted her to find a home that reflected his understanding and his change. The land responded to his efforts. The garden looked healthier. The porch looked welcoming. The fence stood straight once again. One morning, while walking along the dirt path, Clarence saw his neighbor, an elderly woman who had known him and his wife for decades. She smiled at him softly and asked if he was doing all right. Clarence hesitated for a moment before telling her the truth. She listened quietly and then said something simple. She told him love grows where respect is planted. Her words echoed in his mind as he continued his walk. He thought about how his wife must have spent years hoping he would plant those seeds again. He realized he had expected love to remain strong without nurturing it. He had taken comfort in routine, assuming it was enough. Now he understood it was not enough at all. As the days passed, Clarence often found himself walking along the same road where he and his wife used to stroll. One afternoon, while the sunlight filtered gently through the trees, he suddenly felt an overwhelming clarity. Marriage was not a guarantee. It was a responsibility. It was a partnership that required attention every single day. Love was a choice made repeatedly, not simply a feeling remembered from the past. He realized he had expected their marriage to survive on old memories, instead of renewed effort. The wind rustled through the leaves above him, as if agreeing with his thoughts. He closed his eyes and let the truth settle deeply within him. One evening, as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, Clarence sat on the porch again. He looked at the empty chair beside him and felt a mixture of longing and hope. He imagined her sitting there, sharing quiet moments with him as they once had. For the first time in many years, he understood what it meant to truly see another person. He wished he had learned this lesson earlier, but he was grateful to have learned it now. He whispered her name into the soft night air, hoping it carried some of his heart to wherever she was. The porch creaked gently beneath him. The world felt still, waiting. The next morning, Clarence stepped outside and saw a familiar car turning slowly into the driveway. His breath caught. and for a moment he wondered if he was imagining the scene. But the car came closer, and he saw her through the window. She stepped out, holding the letters he had written. She looked tired but not closed off. There was sadness in her eyes, but there was something else too. Something like possibility. Clarence walked toward her slowly, not wanting to startle the moment. The morning air was cool and gentle around them as they stood facing each other. She did not speak first. Neither did he. They simply looked at one another, seeing not the past alone but the future that could still be rebuilt. She stepped toward him, and he stepped closer as well. They walked together toward the porch without speaking. They sat down, side by side, on the wooden chairs that had waited for this moment. The silence between them felt different now. It was not heavy. It was not painful. It was honest. Clarence knew that rebuilding would take time. He knew it would require patience, humility, and consistent respect. But he was ready for it. She looked at him gently, and he felt hope rising inside him like light breaking through clouds. They sat there quietly, watching the morning begin, both understanding that love was still alive. It had simply been waiting for care. It had been waiting for respect to return. They watched the fields stretch out before them. The sun warmed the land. The breeze moved softly around them. Clarence felt peace for the first time in a long while. He had faced the truth. He had grown. And now he had been given a chance to begin again. He reached for her hand slowly. She allowed it. Their fingers intertwined gently, like a bridge rebuilt. Marriage, he realized, did not fall apart because of storms. It fell apart when respect faded, and it was repaired when respect was restored. The world around them continued quietly, holding their moment like a tender promise.